Hello and welcome to another Debating Europe online discussion. My name is Alessandra Cardaci and I will be your moderator today. So today we are going to talk about how we can make citizens happier by offering them better cities. Better cities as in more sustainable, more inclusive, and safer journeys in the way citizens experiment mobility in their cities. Indeed, I don't know about you, but when I do use public transport in my city, I sometimes feel frustrated that I don't feel, the price of the tickets is cheap enough, or they are very reliable, or I feel safe. So today we're going to follow up on what 160 citizens shared with us previously at Debating Europe as part of a European project that aims to put forward recommendations about how we can accelerate the transition, the European Union transition to carbon reduction, and basically hear from expert policymakers how we can indeed provide more inclusive, more accessible cities in terms of mobility and transport for their citizens. So I'm here today with three distinguished speakers. I will introduce them in a moment. But before that, let me just explain that, as I just said, we indeed, as Debating Europe, involve citizens to offer them spaces to discuss about topics that affect their lives. And then with this kind of discussion, we try to follow up on what they discuss and provide them with a bit more clarification and maybe even hope that indeed policymakers, experts are working daily to fix the problems they share with us. And so they feel heard and they feel there is a space for constructive democratic discussion about this topic. So let me start by, first of all, introducing Ivo Petrov, because he's one of our most active and engaged citizens. So thank you so much, Ivo, from Bulgaria, joining us today and representing really the voices of citizens. Secondly, I have to say we were supposed to have another citizen, Sophie from Belgium, who couldn't make it, but don't worry, I will also represent her voice and the voice of other citizens today in this debate. Then I turn to Valentin Lungestras, who is Vice Mayor of Lyon, in charge of, among many other things, mobility. And we are very happy because Lyon is among the 100 European cities that have been selected to start testing more innovative solutions to make mobility more sustainable. And lastly, we have Philippe Roder, who is a director at the London School of Economics Cities Department and associate professor for public policy. So thank you all very much. It's a great panel. So we're very lucky to have the chance to exchange with you today. So we will cover four main topics today, from how to make cities, and especially in terms of mobility, more inclusive, more accessible, to what the EU can do to help cities indeed in this transition, as well as how we can make our air quality better in cities, and also how we can basically try to change the mindset of people from not only offering them decent and high quality public services in terms of transport, but also encouraging them to use them and shift their mindset from car dependency, basically. So I will now start with the first question to Valentin. Valentin is indeed a policymaker, being the deputy mayor of Lyon. So the hope is also that he can bring some interesting lessons learned from the city of Lyon. And the first question that I have for you, Valentin, is indeed about inclusivity and accessibility, because what a lot of citizens share with us is that sometimes they are keen to use public transport, but the problem is that the infrastructure of their cities are not decent enough, or the prices are too high, or public transport are not really reliable. So what is the city of Lyon, for example, doing to tackle all these problems and be a smart, accessible, and sustainable city when it comes to public transport? And indeed, as Sophie, just want to say that Sophie, the other citizen that couldn't make it, also raised a very interesting point about inflation. At the moment, we have rising costs also for transport and public transport as well. And also sometimes remote areas don't feel very well connected to public transport because maybe it's not very appealing for companies running these networks to offer that. So how would you reply to Sophie and the citizens who raised this point? Thank you, Valentin, and over to you.
Thank you, Alessandra. Thank you very much for having me. Just maybe as an introductory comment, of course, public transport is part of a whole transport system in a city. So in Lyon, we're really trying to tackle everything. So improving walking, cycling, public transport, of course, but also things like car sharing, and to push the use of rather small electric cars and maximizing the carpooling. Just like that's a very synthetic way of putting the mobility system in an urban area, but I think it was really important to stress that out as an introductory comment. Then on the public transport part, what I here in Lyon feel, and I know it's the same in other big cities in Europe, is that people first and foremost want more public transport. It's here clearly the first demand I have in Lyon, saying, well, this bus is here, but we want it to be extended. We want it to finish at midnight and not at 10 o'clock. We want a new tramway line, etc. That's the first comment. So I'll get back to the financial part later. But I think it's really important to really invest into public transport. Let it be by really investments or operating costs, but that's the first thing. In Lyon, what we're doing in 6-7 years, we're putting up a investment program of 2.5 billion euros. So basically creating 3 new tramway lines, new buses or improving buses. We extended also a metro line, which was already underway. So basically a whole investment program to improve the public transport offer. And this is really an answer to avoid some car traffic, especially in our city, but also around the city, what is important in the surrounding neighborhoods. What is also for me important here in Lyon is that we're trying of our 3 new tramway lines in terms of inclusivity, actually going to neighborhoods with less income, which was not so much the case before. So that they had before like bus lines. Some of them were good. Some of them were bus lines which were very basic. And we are pushing that these tramways, and because there is a population density that is compatible with tramways, that they go into these neighborhoods so that really all kinds of neighborhoods have the same means of transport, just depending on their need of transport or their density, and not just depending on the income of the population, and because they can live in the city center. That's something that's very important for us. And on the financial aspect, of course, it is important. There is a lot of debate on this topic, of course. In Lyon, we don't think that for big cities, it is a good thing to go all free. There is some cities in Europe that are doing that, but we think that, well, we need to push more public transport offers. So we need some investment capacity, of course. And for that, we need some revenue for our public transport company. But what we do think, and what we did in the beginning of our term, is actually to put up specific pricing for specific publics. So depending on the income, especially, and we put up like specific prices for the less wealthy. For some of them, it's even free per month. For others, it's 10 euros per month instead of the 70 monthly subscription that we have. We lowered also the subscription for students because we're a big student city, and we have a situation where students in France in general are very precarious, and we did some other things like that. So our approach to this is really to go specific, because otherwise going all free is helping people that actually can pay the 70 euros, which are actually for most people not even 70 euros, because in France we have a system where the employers, when you are employed in a company, are actually taking up to 50% and even more of your monthly subscription. It's compulsory in France to take this up. So actually most people pay rather like 35 euros. And even less for some of them. So this is really kind of the financial approach to it, but by not forgetting that we have to push more public transport in the city.
Sounds great. It's very hard to challenge you because everything you said seems very, logical and great examples for other cities to follow. So hopefully, maybe we have other, vice mayors, policymakers watching from other cities who could get in touch and get your best practice as well to follow. So thank you so much, Valentin. It seems like indeed you're really tackling the issue of accessibility, but also making sure indeed that the network is expanding in a fair way and supporting those in need to access the services. So it seems like you're ticking all the boxes. But then this leads me very nicely to the next question, because what we witness sometimes is that offering the infrastructure, maybe it's not enough. There is a problem also of cultural mind shift. There are countries in Europe that are maybe more prone to these changes. Think about the Netherlands, a super bike friendly country. There are other countries that are less keen for cultural reasons to embrace the sort of more public transport way of moving in the city. So, Philip, now I turn to you, and I'm very, very curious to hear what you can tell us about it, how we can change people's mindset towards embracing the other means of transport rather than the car, for example. Thanks.
Thank you, Alessandra. And yes, of course, I mean, the cultural change question is absolutely fundamental. And you're also right, suggesting that it has maybe in the past been often neglected too much. And we are sort of prioritizing the more technological and the infrastructural side. I thought it's actually helpful to first reflect, why is it that we give such a significant priority to technology? And there are a few things. I mean, arguably, major technological changes have fundamentally changed things, not only in terms of our behavior, but how our cities are operating. If you take a long view, you can perfectly see how different new technological innovations have really changed the shape of the public transport-oriented city, or indeed the city that's structured around the car. So no surprise here. It's also often perceived as being apolitical. So the technological stuff just emerges, sometimes through markets. It's being sort of experimented, trial. Citizens react or don't. Lots of trial and error. So it's sort of very organic and evolutionary. And I think that's often convenient for politicians and those that need to take strategic decisions. Think about even the more recent changes about the bike and how the bike has become, again, popular. It actually goes back to technological changes. The invention of the mountain bike in the 1980s, the next generation road bikes, which made urban cycling, again, appealing. It was no longer grandmother's or grandfather's bike. And most recently, of course, electric bikes and bike sharing. Even there, you can see sort of the technological component. And finally, changing culture, and as an extension thereof, also the politics around things, is just more long-term. It's maybe even a generational issue, incredibly tricky to directly target through politics. And people that are in sort of transition studies, they also often use this wonderful term of socio-technical change or socio-technical transitions to emphasize that real change comes when technology goes together with the social dimension and social change. So what can we do about culture? And I think we're using this in our debate here today almost a bit as a proxy for what can we do about car culture, and maybe how can we overcome car culture. And I think the first thing, before unpacking it even further, I would say is we have to attempt to be better at overcoming a polarization, which I detect along two axes. First axis is between those people, residents, citizens, that have a more private rather than a more public-oriented notion of quality of life. Now, you can also say that already being an urban citizen, you are voting with your feet and maybe favoring a more public-oriented quality of life. But there are many people also living in city that almost insulate themselves from that publicness. They lock themselves up in vehicles and very gladly put up the windows, have their own little private space in public space, which is, of course, a bit contradictory. So this is one polarization which we need to appreciate, understand, and overcome. And the second one is, of course, this focus on the here and now of many people, and also concerns about the end of the month, the end of the year, as opposed to very long-term, medium-term sustainable futures, next generations. And this is actually a real concern in our current political debate, that we have lost our capacity to bring those perspectives together. So here are a few ideas what we can do. Clearly, we need to engage much more with each other, and cities are good places to do so. We are closer to our neighbors, we're closer to people who we may disagree with, meeting, having all sorts of new democratic innovation incredibly supports this overcoming of polarization. Then new techniques there on citizen juries and assemblies and mini publics that can help. And as part of this, we need to educate. And we need to be very clear about the trade-offs that exist. We need to communicate that there are consumption ceilings of car use, particularly in cities. There is no road space available for everyone to drive. It's impossible. And if we tell that story in an apolitical, fairly objective way, people get it. And you can then very openly ask, so who should drive? Who should be able to continue to drive? And who should maybe either pay more or be incentivized to change? We need to recognize the key components of contemporary culture that makes the car such an important component of quality of life for some people. So what is driving? What is it that makes it so attractive? And how can we maybe take some components of driving and translate them to new technologies? So that's quite fundamental. We are also not that good still today to appreciate that car culture is a component of a culture of how we live spatially in detached and semi-detached housing and more suburban conditions. And that overcoming car culture means also overcoming that kind of building typology, this type of architecture, that type of urban form. And this is where it gets, of course, even more tricky. Focus on a coalition of the willing, those that live already in walkable neighborhoods that are maybe open to change their behavior, make it easier for them to change and maybe also lead experiments. And then we also have to directly address the drivers that supercharge car culture, from advertisement to policy incentives that exist even in France and Lyon to date, that subsidize driving quite proactively. I'm sure that even in Lyon, and certainly also in London, parking fees are high, but they are not representative of the actual cost. And even the cost of driving is not representative of the cost. So no surprise, people choose to do so. We have to be aware of a status reinforcement by political leaders driving in big vehicles. Not a good idea if you want to proactively encourage different usage. What is it that VIPs are doing and favoring? So all of those things really matter. And then we get to the tangible ones, make the alternatives and the new experienceable by visiting other places, but also by maybe having experiments and trials on the ground that can really help build the infrastructure and the services and the new technology, and they will come ultimately. And then over a longer time, culture around this changes. And then finally, understand the trigger points that really put people off, where they feel attacked, where they feel sort of they are not welcomed, and appreciate their values and their life decisions. So we need to work with this as well. So as part of our communication, we need to be careful here. And then there are other points we need to understand, which are tipping points, where in neighborhoods, in certain parts of the city, maybe as a city as a whole, the mood is really shifting by a small and influential minority that can then really prepare the ground for the majority, and the transition around transport becomes more consensual. So these are a few ideas on the cultural dimension.
Super interesting. A lot of food for thoughts. Thank you so much, Philip, for helping better understanding the challenges, but also the potential solutions, also related to how we engage citizens and overcome polarization about this topic. Ivo, I see you want to come in, so please.
Yes. First of all, I'd like to thank Philip for bringing up these points. And I really liked how he said, let's make this cultural shift more consensual. This is very, very important. And my opinion on this topic might be a little bit controversial, but I would really like to bring the attention to when we're talking about the cultural shift, I would like to shift the attention to people that do not want to have their culture shifted, if I may call it that way. So what I mean is when we're talking about, for example, cycling as an alternative means of going around the city, I have the feeling we are very ready to assume that everyone likes cycling. But I don't think that is the case. I do not think, for example, I frankly do not like the Dutch model. I don't like cities that are that cyclist friendly. I would actually much rather see more means of transportation that are considered sustainable being incentivized. But I really don't want us to fall into this trap of really assuming that everyone wants to ride a bike or assuming that everyone wants less cars. Instead, I think the cultural shift should happen more naturally. And I can really give an example. I'm an avid driver usually. However, I was incentivized to give up driving just because in the city where I live in, Frankfurt, my second home in Germany, parking is absolutely insane. I think that I was just incentivized to think of alternatives, and thankfully, I live in a city that is very able to provide these alternatives. However, I was like naturally incentivized to shift towards this more sustainable culture instead of having something banned, or instead of facing a ban, or facing higher taxes or anything like that. So I really want to include into the discussion this part of people that do not want their culture to be shifted, but that need to be maybe convinced that this cultural shift is something that is helpful to them as well.
Thank you so much, Ivo. I see the conversation is getting hotter. So Valentin, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. You just a very short reaction. I agree with you that there should not be, and in any case, it's not realistic in a city or in an urban area, that there shouldn't be just one means of transport that is pushed up. Currently, it's indeed more some of them, like public transport, more cycling, because we lag behind, kind of, and because of the car culture also changed our city morphology in the last decades. This is why there is some controversial talks about it, because it's pushed so much so that people have the feeling that we're only talking about that. But this is why I made my introductory sentence to say, the mobility system is a whole thing, and everybody's got kind of his place. The one thing I wanted to get back to very quickly is, like, there is a thing that Philip mentioned, is the share of public space. And, in Lyon, we have like an urbanism, like a urban planning that's been 2,000 years old by the history just of the city. There's other cities in Europe that have complete different urban planning. And this makes a huge change in terms of sharing the public space. Here in Lyon, we have very narrow streets. Even our widest avenues are actually quite narrow compared to other cities I know, for instance, in the north of Europe. And so basically what this means is that when you're just putting up like one bike lane or one bus lane so that the bus is actually more efficient, well, actually you need to take away something that is probably very important to someone, because we have something that is already very narrow. And this is the main debate that we have and that I have on a daily basis with people. And let's face it, there is no objective solution to it. It's very subjective, it's very political, and every person will have a different opinion on it, because of course, in the 15 meters that you have from, like, let's say the one facade to the other building, well, there's no objective way to have the best split of means of transport. And I'm only talking here about transport. There's also needed space for, like, just bins and greening and so on. And so this is the main debate that we have, and we have to assume that it is political. There is nothing objective about it. But indeed, it can give the feeling that if you do a bus lane or a cycling lane, well, you take away indeed like one row of parking of on-street parking, or one lane for cars, and indeed it takes away something for someone, because we cannot widen the space in any case.
Thank you, Valentin, for reacting and also welcoming some of the points that Ivo made and addressing the complexity of the topic. Philip, I see you want to jump in, please.
Yes, Ivo, thank you so much for highlighting that. Of course, not everyone wants to cycle. It depends a bit from city to city. What we do know from almost all cities is there's latent unsatisfied demand, i.e., the number of people that would want to cycle is significantly higher than the number of people who actually do it. And whether the potential is at 40 or at 30% in our surveys in London, we detect usually figure around 20 to 30% of people who would actually do it. But currently in London, only 3% do it. So as a result, and I think this is the important thing, if you compare that to any other means of travel, the difference between this latent demand and desire and the actual behavior is probably greatest when it comes to cycling. And then separately, the issue around now driving in cities, there is, of course, a degree of sort of a contradiction because drivers in cities, driving into the city, are seeking for something usually when they come, not being forced to, but wanting to seek a great experience and good night out, dinner, public space, urban culture, all of those things. And also maybe workplaces that work particularly effective because the city has been built in a certain way. In European cities, you're in some ways with the act of driving contradicting that logic. Because if everyone wanted to drive, you couldn't maintain the city as the city presents itself. In a city like Frankfurt, but also many other places in inner city areas, a maximum of 30, probably only 20% can regularly drive. So you're accepting from the beginning, the majority should please do something else. And we then have to ask the question, who do we give this privilege? And I think a lot of people do not appreciate how much it is a privilege to drive in inner city areas. And we're doing quite a lot of research now on car use budgeting, which explains there's much more to drivers. And it's interesting how they react, because if you don't come in with sort of very strong normative statements, you just say like, look, these are the facts and figures. This is just, if you don't want to bulldoze the city and rebuild it, this is what we need to do. And you get very creative ideas of how to think more fairly about who should drive and at what frequency, and maybe not every day. So it's more fairly distributed.
Thank you all. I was kind of sure that the point about culture and technical shift and change would be a very heated point, because indeed it's about us and how we think and our political views. So it's very interesting. But let me just move on very quickly on the next 2 points I'd really like to cover, simply because these are points that, again, came up from the conversation with citizens. So I just want to make sure we can get some feedback on those points too. And for the next point, I will very soon invite Ivo maybe to also jump in, because again, this is something that he himself raised during some of the group discussion we previously had, which is really about what the EU is also doing. Let's remember this conversation is part of a European project that is really about, as I said at the beginning, accelerate the transition towards carbon neutrality. And we're all very curious to understand whether, for example, you, Valentin, as again, from the very local city level, you feel the EU is indeed supporting you as a city towards this shift, or could do maybe something better, as well as because the aim of this very debate is also to come up with some recommendations that we will indeed present to the European Union. But maybe, Ivo, I'd like to just leave it to you to address maybe better than I did the question.
Sure. Thank you, Alessandra. The point that I was making, especially regarding the European Union, is the one that I have thought very often about, because when we're talking about something political, there's obviously this top-down approach and this bottom-up approach, and there's those hybrids and so on and so forth. I think for a citizen discussion, or for making the choice in the end, we really need to look at practice, what works, what doesn't, and so on. And we should really try to avoid the very I would say, complicated taxonomy in when talking to citizens and when asking them about their opinion. So what am I referring to? I'm referring to the following thing. I'm a big fan of decentralized policy making. So what this would be is that I think the European Union itself, it's very often in a position where it tries to create a policy or create a regulation about something, but it tries really to create something that fits all sizes, which is really not something that can work in the European context. When we're talking about mobility, I've had the privilege of living through in different countries throughout Europe, and sometimes in more than one city in the same country. And I can say that the European Union should really try to incentivize different cities to come up with their own local tailor-made solutions for addressing the problem of more sustainable mobility. I would like to circle back to what I said about cycling, because obviously it's a very hot topic. I would like to, if we were to create a policy that really incentivized only, for example, cycling everywhere in Europe, or let's say the 100 biggest cities in Europe, well, I think the mayor of Milan is going to have a very hard time implementing bicycling lanes in a city that is as old as that, in comparison to someone who is, for example, in Belgium or in the Netherlands, where the cities are a lot more cyclist friendly, I would say. So really what I'm getting to is that I really think citizens or the European Union should incentivize local communities to come up with their own solutions. Obviously, there should be some way of tracking the progress. We should make sure that, especially if there's EU funds that are being dispersed for this purpose, we should make sure that there's something happening, there is progress. However, I really think that we should decentralize the whole policy-making system in this way. And we should really, I cannot stress this enough, work on incentives and not on, let's say, banning things or forbidding things from citizens and so on. I do not think that can work.
Thank you, Ivo. Valentin, how do you react to what Ivo just said?
Well, I agree on the fact that on a city level, there's so much to be done and so much actually power to do things. I was elected 4 years ago, and I've seen like how on a city level, actually, if you want to, and if you make the budget decisions that come with it, you can bring up so many things. It takes time, to come up, but you can launch so many things. And I think it is very important that on a EU level, there's more programs, more funds, more frameworks that actually go also on the city level and not through the nation level. It's been done, like we said it, with the 100 climate neutral cities program, for instance, but I think it can be widened, because this, what I call city geopolitics, also cities actually talking with each other and talking about like also the legal framework they have in their countries is something that is very useful. For instance, we had a talk between French and German cities in the last year, where we said actually in France we have this principle of funding for public transport, where actually companies, depending on their size, have like a share of their company revenue that is going into the public transport funding for the local also employees, that they can go to work and so on. And so actually for our public transport company, it's 50% of our revenue that comes from this company contribution. And the ticketing is 30%. So this is something that doesn't exist in Germany. And they were saying like, wow, this is so interesting. Let's talk about it in Germany. Why not? So the city geopolitics, it's so important. And I think it can be done so much more. What we also have, and what is very interesting, is when the EU is not only funding investment, but also operating costs, because there is a lot of things that can be done with operating costs. We're a public service. There is administration agents that are working towards things. And we're lucky to have one incentive from the EU right now, that the evaluation work of 2 of our projects is actually incentivized. So this is operating costs. It's one for the school streets we're implementing, and one other for the on-street parking pricing system that we launched, where we take into account the weight of the cars. And evaluation work from our administration, basically their salary, is taken as a share from the EU so that we can do this evaluation work properly. So I think this is very interesting, not only to think infrastructure investment, but also this work on a daily basis. And maybe just the last thing or two last things I wanted to say on that topic is like what Philip said before, and I think it's so important about like the way we live now. You know, we have been going through decades of metropolization. We have some suburbs that got created. There were less before. We have some of the smaller cities in Europe that got actually emptied from a lot of things, from jobs, from sometimes train stations, from industries, and so on. And I think it's very important that the EU not only focuses on the bigger cities, even though there is now a lot of population in these cities, but please don't forget also the smaller cities. So really small cities, 10,000 inhabitants, 50,000, or 100,000. Please don't forget them, because otherwise, if we continue to empty them, we will have a problem both in the bigger cities as well as on a regional basis. And that's important. And the last thing is, of course, that the EU has to keep up with the global objectives. So let's say, for instance, Fit for 55, to keep up, to not water it down, to keep up, for instance, also the aim of the combustion engine phase out from 2035, because it's also these kinds of measures that like give us the chance to really reach the goals. Otherwise, we won't be able to do it. Doing always less emissions, less air pollution is good, but at some stage we need not just less, but the right amount. And so we need the right amount.
Very, very clear, Valentin. Thank you so much. It's really a message which we will definitely share with the final report addressing the European Union. I'd like now to conclude this debate with the last point, especially bringing Philip in. And then Ivo, at the end, I will also ask you to maybe just come up with a final reflection or a final quick question for our speakers. But before that, Philip, what also came up from the conversation with citizens is the issue of, linking the need of having a more sustainable, accessible, inclusive public transport system with the importance of it when it comes to the healthier environment, healthier, citizens themselves, and the concept of, for example, walkability. This idea of we should have a maximum distance of 15 minutes walk from everything we need. I think you're based in London, so that's questionable there. But basically, what I'm asking you now is to maybe address those elements of the discussion to conclude when it comes to these specific points.
Absolutely. And, walkability and public transport use are very directly related. If you're a public transport user, by definition, you will also walk. It's very rare that the tube ends in the building where you live or where indeed you work or go and have your daily shopping. So a few thoughts on this. Again, we have to appreciate how much good public transport and frequent services of buses, trains, and all sorts of different types of public transport modes is often a function of land use, of the density of people, opportunities that are given within different territories, the level of mixed use, and so on. It's very hard to provide cost effectively a good public transport service in very dispersed, very suburban context. Europe is blessed because it has the sort of traditional sort of European city structure at all scales, from the big to then, Valentin already mentioned, even the city of 10,000 people, often historically built, quite dense still, and there are therefore considerable opportunities. Public transport requires money. It's right that it's being subsidized and that there is a considerable contribution by the general public to support this ultimate public good for how we access each other, services, and so on. The question is just how much can the public, through general taxes, support it? At some point, for reference, I mean, the country that has possibly still the best public transport system across the country is Switzerland. At some point, I did hear estimates that that system per capita may receive more than 5-6 times per person the amount of money compared to Germany, which in itself is a country that is already generous in terms of public transport. So where does this money really come from in the future? Where states, nation states, but also local governments increasingly will find it difficult to raise general taxes. And there is, of course, one very obvious source, and that is road pricing. Road pricing in cities is the vehicle by which economists would certainly highlight is by far the most effective price signaling tool that would generate quite a lot of money. In the case of London, there are estimates, if we did this citywide, it's a 1.5 billion pounds per year, and would to a large extent really replace the significant national government funding that is still put into the system post-COVID. Keep in mind, London Transport Operations is actually one of the systems in the world which recovers the highest percentage through the fare box. That's why it's relatively expensive. So if you want to have good public transport, great vehicles, frequencies, and a network, it costs something. How do you subsidize it? How do you get the revenues? Well, you start charging for the type of city use and road usage that is has been subsidized historically and is very so privileging, and that is, of course, car use. And then there are a range of different regulatory, economic, and also information-based instruments you can think about to further make public transport attractive. New technologies complemented by digital van service, sort of flexible buses and Uber-like taxi services. The micromobility is critical for the last mile. So your e-scooter, your e-bike, all of those things help. And it allows me to come back to Ivo's point about what we sometimes refer to as the pull versus push factors, the incentives versus the sort of restricting interventions. And Ivo, unfortunately, it would be wonderful if I could share the news that research would indicate that you could change behaviors purely based on incentives. It's impossible. It's the cities that have really led these transport transitions, that have delivered proper change, have to bring the two together. Because, and there's one main reason, because car culture has become so pronounced and historically has been supported so much by a disproportionate amount of infrastructure, by the direct subsidies. The average car in Germany per year receives the equivalent of 5,000 euros per year. It's a subsidy. That's the equivalent of the social cost, which the individual car driver doesn't pay for. So that needs to be corrected. Otherwise, you have choices on the basis of distorted pricing. And it's because of that you need to be more interventionist than maybe we would like to be. And interestingly, you said also that the reason why you changed your behavior when you moved to Frankfurt, you said because parking is impossible. And in fact, that's a pretty tough push factor. That wasn't an incentive. It wasn't public transport or walking or cycling was so great. You got pissed off with your car and you felt, I'm just giving up. And that's unfortunately the reality for most people changing their behavior around car use. Now, this situation becomes awfully frustrating if you then don't have the proper alternative. And I hope in Frankfurt you feel actually they have done a fairly good job of giving you an alternative. You don't feel stuck in your flat and you don't feel you can connect to the city, because that will be truly terrible, right? So you can only use those push factors if you have something to offer, and that's fundamental.
Thank you, Philip. We're about to close the discussion, though I would love to continue because it's extremely interesting, especially bringing all of you together with all your different perspectives. So thank you, Philip, for that reply. But Ivo, I turn to you to maybe wrap up or ask a very last question, but I ask all of you to be very short so we can finish on time. Ivo, over to you.
Thank you, Alessandra. I'll be very short. Just shortly to address what Philip said. Philip, thank you for pointing out that according to research, we need both the carrot and the stick, not only the carrot. I was actually not aware of this. And maybe we have some slightly different definitions of an incentive. For example, for me, just not being able to park is not actually a pushback. It's not actually a penalty. It's just nobody banned me from doing anything. I just wasn't able to do it naturally. So for me, I don't really interpret it as a restrictive measure, to be honest. But anyways, I don't want to get too much into that thing. I wanted to maybe say two things. First of all, I would like to reflect on the fact that it's very, very nice to be able to talk to experts that actually come up with data and facts about the topic that we're talking about, because really the attention was given to things that I would have never thought about. However, I would like to say that I think both Valentin and Philip mentioned about it's not really a question whether or not everyone should drive. It's a question to who do we give this privilege to? So I think we should redirect our attention to developing tools and instruments, mechanisms that really determine who should be able to drive. We should really determine a mechanism that really takes all of this data, takes all of these factors, and then spits out some result that can be hopefully satisfactory to all. And maybe just in the final minute, I would like to mention an idea I have mentioned in the previous debates, which it's not my own idea. I stole it actually from, I think, UK's #1 podcast. It's by Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart. They really like to mention this thing that they call citizen councils, where when they make decisions for a city, they really take 100 random people that are citizens of the city. And when they mean random people, really random people, and all of these people discuss and clash and so on. So that would be, and I know we don't really have time to go into it, but I just wanted to propose some sort of like to offer an idea of how to start developing this mechanism of determining who should drive, what should be the alternatives, how much do we tax at all, and so on and so forth, because it is also possible to have too good of a urban mobility system. But anyways, thank you.
Thank you, Ivo. And indeed, you're touching upon a quite important topic, which is really citizens' participation engagement, which is also linked to what Philip was telling before. It's such a polarizing topic that sometimes by bringing randomly selected people together, offering them spaces for learning more and better about the topic, and then sharing their personal experiences about the topic, and really help creating a moment of social exchange, constructive exchange, and then coming up with recommendations that, as you said, Ivo, throughout the panel discussion, need to take into account the realities of people, not just the ideology or principles. So I think you managed to end the discussion in a very constructive and positive way. So I'd like to just wrap up simply by mention a few keywords that we heard today. And first of all, I just want to thank you all so much, Ivo, for your constant engagement. You're really an example of active citizenship. So please keep up. And to those watching, join us at Debate Europe, because we really offer every one of you who want to, feel a better engaged citizen and have the opportunity to learn, exchange. And as Ivo said himself today, he learned a lot, and myself as well. And of course, I also want to thank Valentin for all your great work you're doing in Lyon and sharing these best practices and example that give us a lot of hope. What you mentioned about, exchanging with German cities who can take your example is really the spirit of Europe, I think, of the mission. And also, stressing the fact that it's not just investment per se, but it's also the kind of investment and cost you can cover at EU level, and many other things you said in terms of, allocating resources in a smart way. So instead of offering maybe for free public transport to everyone, but rather allocating to those who are really in need. And Philip, lastly, thank you so much for bringing the expertise. We could really tell you're an academic and you really share the data, as Ivo said, which is so important today in our debates, to make things sound and reliable information indeed, and for mentioning so many valid points from, the cultural shift, the importance of engaging citizens, educating, and also taking into account the complexity indeed of what we're talking about. That also includes for example, urban design, not just public transport per se, and so on and so forth. So I hope I managed to wrap up all your thoughts well. And I just want to say to all of you again, thank you so much. To our community that is watching online, thank you for watching, and stay tuned, because this is just the first one of a series of many other panel discussions. We will cover other topics, for example, healthy soils, oceans, and how we can adapt to climate change. So all topics that are related to the EU missions as part of this project. So again, thank you so much. Stay tuned. Follow us on social media at Diveni Europe, and see you next time. Thank you very much.